Welcome. Come on in. Gather round the fire, friends, where the snow falls in sheets and shadows grow long. This isn't the season of cheer. Not here. In these tales, carols turn to cries, gifts bring dread, and the warmth of the hearth can't stop the cold of what waits beyond the door. I'm Sam Hain, and tonight we'll unwrap the darker side of Christmas. After all, winter isn't the only thing that bites. The air was brittle, so cold it felt like it could shatter with a careless breath. The village of Glenroan lay nestled under a heavy blanket of snow. The little stone cottages clustered close together, like sheep bracing against a storm. Icicles hung from the eaves, glinting faintly in the weak light of the overcast sky. Snowflakes drifted lazily, adding to the pristine white that muffled every sound. Jamie MacRae walked alone through the woods behind his cottage, the crunch of his boots the only sound in the silence. He moved with his shoulders hunched, his hands shoved deep into his jacket pockets. At 13, he was gangly and tall, but his steps were weighted with the weariness of someone much older. His breath formed fleeting clouds in the frosty air, dissipating before they could linger, just like everything else. It had been a year since the storm, a year since the mountain swallowed his father whole, leaving behind nothing but echoes and shadows. A year since Jamie stood, frozen in terror while the world turned to chaos around him. People told him it wasn't his fault, that he was just a boy, but their words only sharpened the jagged edges of his guilt. He could have done something. He should have done something. Now, every day felt like trudging through a blizzard, aimless and endless. The warmth of Christmas, the laughter, the lights, the music, felt like a foreign language he no longer understood. The cottage had decorations this year, but they looked out of place, like costumes on a stage. Callum had tried. His little brother had carefully arranged paper snowflakes on the windows and strung popcorn garlands by the fire. But Jamie couldn't bring himself to help, couldn't bring himself to pretend. Back at the cottage, Callum would be sitting by the window, his small face pressed against the frosted glass, waiting. Callum was only 8, but his eyes were wiser than they should have been. He still looked up to Jamie, still wanted his big brother to laugh and tell stories like he used to. But Jamie couldn't meet those hopeful eyes anymore. Callum deserved someone better. Jamie wandered deep into the woods, the familiar path leading him nowhere. Snow gathered on the bare branches above, and the world grew quieter with every step. He wasn't sure how long he'd been walking when he noticed her. The girl stood beneath an ancient pine, her figure almost blending with the snow around her. She had wild, silvery hair that tumbled down her shoulders, and her eyes were a striking mossy green. Her cloak shimmered like frost in the pale light. Jamie stopped, his breath catching in his throat. The girl smiled, a gentle curve of her lips that felt strangely out of place in the icy air. Jamie MacRae, she said, her voice as soft and as cold as snow falling on water. Jamie's heart skipped. Who are you? A friend, she said simply. Someone who knows the weight you carry. Jamie's jaw tightened. He looked away, his hands balling into fists in his pocket. I don't need a friend. Everyone needs a friend, especially those who think they don't. Her words were quiet, but they lingered in the air, refusing to be ignored. Jamie shook his head. You don't know anything about me. The girl stepped closer, her footprints leaving no mark in the snow. I know you carry guilt like a stone in your chest. I know you've shut yourself away from people who love you. And I know you're afraid to feel again, because you think you don't deserve to. Jamie's breath hitched. He turned to glare at her, anger and pain burning behind his eyes. You don't understand. Her gaze softened, and she reached out a hand. Let me show you something. Before he could stop himself, Jamie took her hand. The world spun, and the forest melted away. They stood on a snow-dusted hill overlooking the cottage, its uneven rooflines frosted white against the inky evening. Warm, golden light spilled from the windows, pulling onto the snow in soft, glowing puddles. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, a thread of warmth rising into the bitter December air. From this distance, the cottage looked like a perfect postcard of Christmas, but inside, the cracks ran deep. Jamie's gaze was drawn to the firelit scene within. Through the frosted panes, he could see Callum perched on the edge of the hearth, his small frame curled into himself as though bracing against more than just the cold. The fire cast flickering shadows across his face, illuminating the slight furrow in his brow, and the way his fingers fidgeted absently with the edge of a threadbare blanket. His shoulders were slumped, the weight of unspoken worries pressing down on them. Callum turned his head toward the door, the movement hesitant and filled with yearning. Jamie's chest tightened as he saw the brief flash of hope that lit Callum's face, only to watch it dim just as quickly when the door remained closed. His little brother's eyes, so wide and searching, had taken on a shadowed hollowness that Jamie couldn't ignore. He looked so much younger, so much smaller than Jamie remembered, as though the year had drained something essential from him, leaving behind a boy clutching at fragments of comfort and love. He waits every day, the girl said softly, her voice both smoothing and a burden at once. Not because he needs you to be perfect, but because he needs you to be there. Jamie's throat ached, his breath catching as he stared at the quiet tableau of longing and loss. He hadn't realised how much Callum had been carrying, how deeply his absence had hollowed out the boy he used to play games with, tease and protect. Shame and sorrow churned within him, battling the cold, numbing shell that built around his heart. He watched as Callum's gaze flickered back toward the door again, the same fleeting, desperate spark lighting his face. For a moment, it looked like Callum was holding his breath, willing the door to open. When it didn't, his small shoulders sagged, and he turned back to the fire, the flicker of hope extinguished. Jamie's vision blurred as the boy's quiet resignation clawed at something deep inside him. He doesn't blame you, the girl continued, her voice quieter now, layered with a deep understanding. But he misses you. The brother who used to laugh, who used to make him feel safe. Jamie's knees felt weak, and he dropped his gaze to the ground, unable to bear the weight of the truth in her words. I don't know how to go back, he whispered, his voice breaking like the ice beneath his boots. You don't have to, she replied gently, her words wrapping around him like a blanket against the cold. You just have to take one step forward. When Jamie opened his eyes, they were back in the forest. The wind whispered softly through the trees, carrying the faint scent of pine and frost. The girl stood before him, her shimmering cloak catching the light of the moon as it filtered through the bare branches. Her smile was small, tinged with sadness, but also something else. Hope. "The snow is heavy," she said, her voice quiet yet steady. "But you don't have to carry it alone." Her words lingered in the cold air, sinking into Jamie's chest like a distant melody he had almost forgotten. For so long, he'd carried his guilt in silence, convinced that to let anyone share it would be a betrayal of what he had lost. But now, for the first time, he allowed himself to consider another possibility. That he didn't have to carry it forever. That maybe, just maybe, the weight he bore could become lighter if he let someone else in. Something shifted inside him, subtle, but undeniable, like the first crack of a frozen river breaking under the warmth of the sun. He thought of Callum, his little brother who had waited by the window every day, clinging to a hope that Jamie had long since abandoned. Callum who had held on to the belief that his brother would come back, not just in body, but in heart. The image of his brother's face, a mixture of joy and longing, burned in Jamie's mind. And for the first time in a year, he wanted to be the person Callum believed he could still be. He turned toward the path home. The snow still stretched before him, deep and untrodden, but it no longer seemed insurmountable. The cold still nipped at the skin, but it didn't cut as deeply. Each step felt lighter, each breath fuller, as though the air itself had grown softer. When Jamie reached the cottage and pushed open the door, the warmth of the fire greeted him, wrapping him in a comforting embrace. But it was the look on Callum's face that truly thawed the frozen parts of his heart. His little brother's eyes widened, lighting up like the star that crowned the Christmas tree in the corner of the room. "Jamie!" Callum cried, his voice breaking with excitement as he rushed forward, flinging his arms around his brother with all the force his small frame could muster. Jamie knelt, gathering Callum into a hug so fierce it seemed to convey everything he had been unable to say for the past year. He felt the press of his brother's cheek against his shoulder, the tremble of his small hands clutching at his jacket, and in that moment, Jamie realised how much he had missed this. Missed being needed, being loved, and being there for someone who mattered more than anything. "I'm sorry, Cal," Jamie whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm so sorry." Callum pulled back just enough to look up at him, his eyes shining with tears. "You don't have to be sorry. You're here now." Jamie's chest tightened, and for a moment he couldn't speak. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting a golden glow over the room. The decorations Callum had worked so hard on, paper snowflakes, popcorn garlands, a lopsided angel on top of the tree, suddenly seemed brighter, more beautiful. They weren't perfect, but they were full of love, and that was enough. As Jamie held his brother close once more, he felt like the weight in his chest dissolved, replaced by a warmth that spread through him like the first rays of sunlight after a long winter. The frost that had gripped his heart melted away, leaving room for something he thought he had lost forever. Hope. For the first time in a year, Jamie smiled. A real, unguarded smile that reached his eyes and lit up his face. He pulled Callum into another hug, his laughter mingling with his brother's as the heaviness of the past began to fade. And in that tiny cottage, surrounded by the glow of fire and the unshakable love of his little brother, Christmas came back to life, not as a celebration of perfection, but as a testament to the power of forgiveness, family, and finding warmth in the coldest of seasons. Thank you for listening to A Brother's Love in Winter's Shadow. Jamie's journey reminds us that not everyone feels joy during the holidays, and for some, this time of year can be as cold and heavy as the snow outside. But just as Jamie found warmth and light through the love of his brother, there's hope for us all if we give ourselves and others a little patience and understanding. This Christmas, let's remember to check in on those who may be struggling. Sometimes, smallest acts of kindness can melt the heaviest snow. Stay safe, stay warm, and from me, Merry Christmas.